You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, you were in the courtroom today when one of Donald Trump's most high-profile prosecutions seemed to go down in flames. Can you explain what happened in court?
Yeah, Brian, in the James Comey prosecution, vindictive prosecution, we started the day with 3 motions to dismiss, and courtesy of the judge pressing Lindsay Halligan and the other assigned prosecutor and getting answers that exposed more wrongdoing, potential wrongdoing, we walked out of that courtroom with a 4th motion to dismiss. I mean, things are going from bad to worse for Lindsay Halligan and, by extension, Pam Bondi and Donald Trump's Department of Justice. Here's what happened. We were in court today to hear the arguments on why the case should be dismissed based on vindictive prosecution. And a really experienced and impressive attorney named Michael Dreeben argued on behalf of James Comey, and it was a fabulous argument. I think he's presented like 100 arguments or more to the Supreme Court. And then when the prosecutor got up, this guy Tyler Lemons, and started arguing, things went from bad to worse. Here is kind of boiled down to its essence what the issue involves. There was always this curiosity because Lindsay Halligan had 2 indictments in the Comey case. One was an indictment where there were 3 charges, and it looked like the grand jury voted to indict 2 charges, but voted a no bill, not to indict the 3rd charge. But then Lindsay Halligan had a 2nd indictment with just those 2 charges that the grand jury voted to indict. And she walked into court for what's called the grand jury return. You go right from the grand jury to the court, to a judge, and you turn in those with the foreman of the grand jury. You turn in the indictment, and that is entered in the record, and that represents the commencement of the criminal case. She walks in with 2, and the judge is like, why do you have 2, and why are they inconsistent, and why did you sign both of them? And her answer was basically, humana. She doesn't know because she's an insurance lawyer. She has no idea what she was supposed to do and what she wasn't supposed to do in the grand jury. But the judge ended up accepting the 2-count indictment, and there never was an adequate explanation for why there were 2 conflicting indictments. Well, we got the explanation today in open court. The judge pressed them. They said, I want to know what you did after the grand jury issued that 1st indictment, voting out an indictment on 2 charges, but a no bill on the 3rd charge. What did you do after that? And basically what the prosecutors said, and at one point he wasn't happy with the answers he was getting from Tyler Lemons because he had to keep going over to Lindsay Halligan and whispering in her ear and then coming back and talking to the judge. And at one point, it was beautiful. Judge Nachmanoff said, Miss Halligan, step to the podium. This is the first time we've heard Lindsay Halligan speak in court. You know, the smartest thing she ever did was decline to speak at any of the other hearings in this case or the Letitia James case. And he's like, what did you do? And here is what we learned. We learned that the grand jury, after they returned that 3-count indictment, 2 votes to indict, 1 vote not to indict, Lindsay Halligan or somebody at the U.S. Attorney's Office went back and created a new indictment, kind of virtually whited out the one where they voted not to indict, created a new one. She signed the new one, and she walked into court with the new one and the old one. Brian, here's the problem. We didn't know until today that the grand jury had never seen the 2nd indictment. They never considered the 2nd indictment. They never voted on the 2nd indictment as the rules and the law provide they must, even if it happens to be a different version of charges that they already voted in favor of indicting. It must be represented to the grand jury, and it wasn't. And Judge Nachmanoff said, by the way, there's a case from 1969 called the Gaithers case. Here's the site. Look it up, and then you better make some supplemental arguments in writing to me about why that doesn't, he didn't say it this way, but I've read the Gaither case now, why that doesn't require me to dismiss this indictment for a 4th reason. So for anybody keeping score at home, we've already seen litigated, and I was in court when it was argued, the motion to toss out the indictment because Lindsay Halligan was unlawfully appointed as interim U.S. attorney. There was another judge, Judge Curry, who presided over that argument, and she said she's going to have an opinion on that before Thanksgiving. That could be any day now. Reason number 1 to throw it out. Reason number 2 to throw it out is what we learned today, an improper procedure that Lindsay Halligan used. Reason number 3 is a substantive reason. It's the abuse of the grand jury by Lindsay Halligan. And we just got a blockbuster opinion from yet another judge who's involved in this case, who said, wait a minute, Lindsay Halligan went into the grand jury and argued contrary to the rule of law, including misstating James Comey's right not to incriminate himself, not to testify now or at a future trial. Plus, there's a second reason. It looks like Lindsay Halligan put an FBI agent on to testify to the grand jury, and he shared incompetent evidence, attorney-client privileged communications, which may never be presented to a grand jury. That's reason number 3. And reason number 4 is the vindictive prosecution. Brian, this case goes away, and in my mind, the only question is how many different motions to dismiss will be successful.
What are next steps here, given the fact that we've seen such a catastrophic fallout after today's hearing? What are the immediate next steps?
Immediate next steps are we're going to get a ruling from Judge Curry. We're going to get a ruling from Judge Nachmanoff. I suspect we're going to get those rulings pretty soon, maybe in the coming days. And they will be what we call case dispositive rulings. In other words, case dismissed, probably with prejudice, which means it can never be rebrought. You can't cure these defects that were created by Lindsay Halligan. So, and then there will inevitably be an appeal. But I'll tell you, and Judge Nachmanoff today, Brian, actually asked, should we rule on these motions or should we wait to rule on all of the motions to dismiss, so they're kind of all there in the record? And what James Comey's lawyer said, Michael Dreeben, he said, Your Honor, I think the case dispositive motions, the ones that if granted this case goes away entirely and can't be rebrought, are probably motions that you can go ahead and rule on. I will say Judge Nachmanoff couldn't have been more receptive to James Comey's lawyer's arguments today and could not have been more critical of the arguments being made by Tyler Lemons and Lindsay Halligan.
All of these defects notwithstanding, what about the fact that Lindsay Halligan may have been improperly appointed to her position, and so all of her prosecutions may be moot anyway?
Yeah, absolutely. If that ruling goes against the Department of Justice, goes against Lindsay Halligan, that she was just not lawfully appointed, guess what the other case is that immediately gets dismissed, probably with prejudice?
Letitia James.
That's the Letitia James prosecution. And we're still just getting warmed up in that one because the motions arguments are coming up in the very near term in the Letitia James case. And let me just share this because this was really pretty shocking to me. There were multiple times when Judge Nachmanoff asked the prosecutors, is there a declination memo in this case? Now, why is that an important question? Because if the prior career prosecutors, including Eric Siebert, who was Donald Trump's interim U.S. attorney before he was forced to resign or he got fired because he wouldn't bring an evidence-free bad faith prosecution against James Comey, he almost certainly authored what we call a declination memo, setting out the reasons why this case could not and should not be prosecuted. Judge Nachmanoff was like a dog on a bone. He kept asking, is there a declination memo? Is there a declination memo? The reason that's important is because if there is one, it must be given to the defendant, because the Constitution says if you have exculpatory evidence as a prosecutor, evidence that could help the defendant in his case, you are required by the Constitution, the Due Process Clause, to give it to the defense so he can use it in his defense. And you know the answer he got from Tyler Lemons to the question, is there a declination memo? At first he got the humana, but then he got this, Brian. Well, the Deputy Attorney General, hasn't really given me authority to answer that question. It made it sound like the Deputy Attorney General, Todd Blanche, said if you get asked if there's a declination memo, don't answer that question. That is a real danger zone because that conjures up potential misconduct, unethical conduct. And, he made some noises about, well, it would be protected by work product privilege or what's called the deliberative process privilege. The judge said, no. I'm not asking you what's in it. I'm asking you if one was prepared. He never got an answer. But then Judge Nachmanoff wasn't willing to let it go. He said, okay, was there a prosecution memo prepared? Let me just tell our viewers, There is almost no difference between a declination memo and a prosecution memo. I authored both probably 100 times or more. They both set out all of the facts, all of the evidence that was presented to the grand jury, all of the witnesses who testified before the grand jury. Then you apply the law and you analyze whether you have a case that should be indicted or shouldn't or can't be indicted. If you decide it shouldn't be indicted, we call it a declination memo. If you decide it should be indicted, we call it a prosecution memo, but they are virtually indistinguishable from one another. And I am not going to summarize or paraphrase. I'm going to read you what Tyler Lemons said when he was asked multiple times, is there a prosecution memo? He said to the judge, quote, my understanding is a draft prosecution memo had been prepared. You know what the next question was? Did you see it? Did you review it? You're now the prosecutor in the case. Did you review the prosecution memo that you said, well, your understanding is one had been prepared? And he very sheepishly finally said, yes, I read it. Well, then why didn't you just answer the question? Yes, Your Honor, a prosecution memo has been prepared and I reviewed it. Brian, this thing was so ugly and unseemly. And the way these prosecutors evaded, directly and candidly answering questions from the judge makes me think they are all going to bar counsel for ethics investigations and possible sanctions.
Glenn, at the beginning of this year, I was really skeptical about seeing all of these law enforcement officials, prosecutors at the FBI and the DOJ resigning in protest. And I know you and I had actually gone back and forth about this, where I was worried that seeing good people resign, virtuous though it may be, is only going to give the DOJ the opportunity to fill those now vacant seats with people who are going to be much more aligned with this administration, who are going to be way less discerning about the stuff that gets thrown at them, and who are going to be loyalists to this president and this administration. And I know that you had pushed back on that and said that when the DOJ and the FBI lose good prosecutors, that undermines their ability to do a good job in court. And so, given what we've seen today, do you feel a sense of vindication now that we're seeing people like Lindsay Halligan try to make her way through these court cases where it's her own incompetence and the DOJ's own incompetence with inept and incompetent prosecutors and officials that's ultimately causing them to lose a lot of these cases that otherwise they would have put a lot of political capital in trying to win?
Yeah, it's a great topic to tease out, Brian, because it's really hard to say there is a definitive right or wrong answer to the question, should good, honest, ethical prosecutors who are doing the work of the American people day in and day out, should they just self-select and leave because they don't want to be part of the Trump administration and they don't want to be called on to, handle cases unethically? Or should they stand up, keep doing the hard work, and then wait to be terminated, wrongfully terminated, when they're asked to do something unethical? You can make the argument that, that one is better than the other, but I guess at the end of the day, I don't criticize anybody for making the decision. I will not be part of this horrendous, unethical Trump Department of Justice. I'm gone, and I'll fight for justice on the outside in any way I can. And what I do, I am actually enjoying, I don't celebrate it, but I'm enjoying watching these prosecutors squirm because, one, they don't know what the hell they're doing, and two, even more troubling, is they're willing to do the wrong thing to please dear leader. And I'm glad that's being exposed to the harsh light of day. I'm glad these cases are going to go down in flames because, among other things, it will show that Donald Trump is the paper tiger that he truly is. He can, claim, I'm going to prosecute everybody and lock them up. No, you can bring a vindictive indictment. You can bring an indictment that's going to suffer, not one, but 4 dismissals, 4 reasons to dismiss it. And guess what? That means you're weak as an aspiring dictator because you can't follow through on your threats. And we see Donald Trump, we see his dictatorial grip weakening every day in so many ways. And I think once that grip, the grip of the aspiring dictator weakens, it doesn't tend to retighten. He tends to just implode and lose all power.
All right, well, we will leave it there. For those who are watching, if you'd like to stay on top of this story as it relates to the potential dismissal of the vindictive prosecutions against Letitia James and James Comey, as well as all the other legal news that's happening right now, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on the screen. Best way to support our work, and it's 100% free. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.